As we have previously explored on Words and Coffee, New Jersey has the dubious honor of being sandwiched between major metro areas of New York City and Philadelphia, which make it prime real estate for industry. Thus, as part of the starting lineup for the two-time World War Championship team, Jersey was often tasked for wartime production. And like a tragic foreshadowing to the Hercules disaster that would precede America's entry into World War II, there was another terrible accident way back in 1918 that would be in many ways far worse. Welcome to Words and Coffee, where we talk interesting history about the Garden State and showcase a bag of small batch roasted goodness. Today's brew is from Bucks County Coffee Company, their breakfast blend. And the history is the 1918 munitions factory explosion in Morgan, New Jersey. Let's get to it. Now, while the U.S. had been providing to both sides up until 1917, the entry of doughboys into the European theater would ensure that future shipments would only go one way. While there were already production lines in Kenville and Picatinny Arsenal, another facility was in the process of being brought online in Morgan. This new line would be located along the shore, greatly simplifying the task of moving long-range landscape adjustment tools by the literal millions. The Morgan factory was founded by T.A. Gillespie and originally called the American Shell Company, and it was a big 'un. Over 700 buildings sprawled across more than 2,000 acres in what is today the town of Perth Amboy, Sayreville, and Morgan, with the main core of buildings located in the area bounded by Dusco, Gillen, and Rota drives, and having an output capacity measured in the millions of tons. Their primary job was manufacturing high explosives and then filling shell bodies, turning inert pieces of metal into Satan's Easter eggs. Now, some of you may be wondering why they never thought to build near a water source before. Seems like that would make things a lot easier. It's closer to Europe! As is so often the case, there's a reason for that. A really good one. See, it turns out that our ancestors weren't actually dumb. They understood that working with high explosives was, who'd have thought it, an inherently dangerous activity, one they typically sought to contain to remote locations. For safety. However, this was a boom time for those that made booms, and allowances were made. They needed employees, and employees come from towns. Keep in mind, this was before a 90-minute commute by personal vehicle was the standard. The Morgan Munitions Depot officially opened for business in June of 1918, and it would close before the end of the conflict it had been intended to support. Friday, October 4th, 1918. The massive load operation at Sayreville employed some 6,000 workers across 3 8-hour shifts. And as often seems to be the case, it was around the change in shift that things get wonky. Around 7:40 p.m., an explosion occurred. We don't know the exact particulars, only that no fire or apparent cause preceded it, and it was in the vicinity of Building 611 near Chesapeake Road, a building that would cease to exist in short order as it disappeared into a giant fireball. Building 611 contained vast quantities of boosters. That's the intermediary step on an ignition train. Less sensitive than an initiator, but not as dangerous as straight-up TNT. Still, it's an energetic material and certainly enough to ruin your day. Or, in this case, spread the fire to actual high explosives. For reasons that were never officially determined, the figurative fuse had been lit, and now there's nothing to do but let the awful disaster run its course. To be clear, there was some thought put into safety. The long-term storage magazines were heavy bunkers, backed with dirt and concrete and located 2 miles away with a swamp between. Those never went kablooey. In fact, there had been another accident at the Gillespie subsidiary in Runyon, about 4 miles away. A fire had broken out, and newspapers were still running stories about how lucky it was that the fire had not reached the magazines. As the great Scotsman would say, in the business, this is known as foreshadowing. In the case of the Morgan plant, they would not be so fortunate. See, the temporary magazines, meant more as a staging area than long-term storage, were mostly made of wood. As you can imagine, this was something called into serious question during the ensuing investigation. But even then, it was just a fire, right? Couldn't they just put it out? So this'll be the third time that this has happened. Smaller explosions caused by the initial fire knocked out the power plant, and thus electricity, and therefore the water pumps, and therefore no water. So, yeah. Meanwhile, the workers fled. Belongings were left behind as they attempted to escape as quickly as they could. Sporadic explosions ensued for the next hour as boosters and shells cooked off all over the facility, until about 8:45 when a big one came. A thundering blast erupted, shattering windows throughout the town of Perth Amboy. If anyone hadn't been paying attention up until this point, they definitely were now. The military soon set up a perimeter to prevent people from wandering into the facility. But Wes, why would people go towards an explosion? As was the case in my video on the Morrow Castle shipwreck and the Picatinny explosion, the dirty truth is that we kind of love disasters. So with no expectation that the explosions would continue for the next 12 hours, some folks got it in their heads that maybe they'd just kind of take a gander. Meanwhile, the first responders had their hands full. Unable to effectively fight the fire, efforts turned instead to the evacuation. Most every vehicle in the area, public, private, handcart, what have you, was pressed into service. As it was, many families fled into the surrounding countryside, then undeveloped, with nothing more than the clothes on their back. This lasted throughout the night, with minor to moderate explosions popping off so rapidly that one source described it as the tattooing of a drum.
We're still trying to figure out the meaning of that last phrase.
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. Like, the fast buzzing sound is amplified by a drum? Maybe it's got some old-timey meaning. Point is, thankfully, most of the residents had gotten out of Dodge that night. Among them were Frank Norcross, his wife, daughter, sister, and brother-in-law. They made it to his mother's house in Ocean Grove, shaken but thankfully unhurt. They were safely away for what came next. By the following day, Saturday, October 5th, neighboring South Amboy, Perth Amboy, and Sayreville, a combined population of 62,000 people, had mostly been evacuated. At 9:50 that morning, a warning was issued from the local police. The fire had reached the temporary magazines stored with completed shells. And at 10:05, the worst of the explosions ripped through the rubble. A concussion blasted through the air, breaking windows as far away as Jersey City and West Bergen. Another one, nearly as bad, broke at 10:30. When the dust settled and the air went still again, there remained a crater the size of a football field, 50 feet deep. It was so bad that the subway service in New York City was halted for safety concerns. Thankfully, these fears at least turned out to be unfounded. The fires continued throughout the afternoon on Sunday when officials had to address one final wrinkle. Potential disaster was averted by the heroic actions of Coast Guardsman Lieutenant E. Stika, Assistant Master's Mate Noble, and Seaman Grimes, who volunteered to move a train of 9 cars loaded with explosives from the path of fire. The tracks leading out of the area had been destroyed, so they relocated it in a deep cut between 2 hills about a mile away. Thankfully, it was enough. For this, all of them were awarded the Navy Cross. The remaining fires were soon brought under control, and it seemed the danger was finally over. Except... Among the survivors, a new problem was becoming apparent. Remember, this was 1918, and the influenza epidemic was still very much in full swing. Even days later, the Red Cross and various hospitals were noticing an uptick in flu cases resulting from the influx of new patients. In some cases, an increase of 200%. Thus, there was a certain incentive to get people back in their homes, such as they were. Estimates vary, but as much as 12 million pounds of high explosives were thought to be destroyed, enough to supply the Western Front for 6 months. Damage to the plant itself was valued at $18 million in 1918 money, so like $380 million today. But only $300K was paid to area residents. Because then, as now, it would hold the dubious distinction of being in the top 10 of largest non-nuclear explosions in history, and the effects would linger for the next century. In 1994 and 97, shells were discovered during excavation at Dwight Eisenhower Elementary. In total, over 5,000 pieces were discovered. In fairness, I think these were inert fragments, but still. Then again, in 2007, actual ordnance was discovered when workers were installing a playground at Samsel Upper Elementary School. And just to put a cherry on this thing, the mascot for Sayreville High School? The Bombers. Yeah. Since company records were destroyed in the blast, we don't actually know how many were supposed to be working that night, and thus how many were lost. Due to the intensity of the explosions, it wasn't even possible to count the remains, but the best guess is about 100 people. Partial remains were collected and buried in a mass grave off Ernston Road, in what is today Old Bridge Township. The inscription reads, "In memory of the unidentified dead who gave their lives while in service of the United States of America at the Morgan Shell Loading Plant in the explosion of October 4 to 5, 1918. That'll about do it for me. If you stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. As usual, sources in the description. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.